The clock on the microwave read 6:42 a.m. when the sound began. It wasn't the usual morning chorus of birds or the low hum of the well pump. It was the distinct, grating whine of a portable generator, followed by the aggressive crunch of tires on my graveled driveway. I was standing at the kitchen sink, a mug of black coffee in my hand, watching the steam curl up into the cool air of the dawn. My ranch, my 300 acres of quiet, was bordered on the east by the manicured lawns and identical houses of the Oak Creek Estates, a development that had sprung up a decade ago, like a crop of expensive mushrooms. The sound was coming from there, or rather from the edge of it, where their world met mine. I didn't move. I just stood and listened. I heard the clank of metal on metal, the murmur of men's voices, and then one voice, sharp and imperious, that cut through the rest. Carolyn Bradshaw, president of the Oak Creek Homeowners Association. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was bitter, just how I liked it. I had been expecting something like this. Not this exactly, but something. The final move in a game she thought she was winning. I walked to the front door, my old boots making no sound on the worn pine floors my grandfather had laid. I opened it just enough to see, without being seen. There, parked 20 feet inside my property line, was a white utility van from a local electrical contractor. Two men in hard hats were unloading equipment, and standing beside them, pointing a finger at the large gray utility box that sat next to the main power pole, was Carolyn. She was dressed in what she probably considered power casual, a pink tracksuit and gleaming white sneakers. Her arms were crossed, her chin was jutted out, and she was speaking with the absolute certainty of someone who has never been told no in a context that mattered. I couldn't hear her exact words, but I could guess the gist. She was giving orders. Orders to men who were standing on my land, preparing to tamper with my power supply. The utility box and the pole it was attached to were the primary junction for the electrical feed to my entire property. The house, the barn, the well pump, the workshop. It was all mine. The feed that supplied the Oak Creek Estates, however, branched off from a substation a quarter-mile deeper into my property, a fact that was central to the entire ridiculous drama. I finished my coffee, rinsed the mug, and placed it in the drainer. I walked to my office, a room lined with books on civil engineering, property law, and hydrology. My father's room, and his father's before him. On the large oak desk, there sat a single, thick, forest green file folder. It was closed. I didn't need to open it. I knew its contents by heart. Instead, I picked up my phone from its charger. I swiped to the camera, hit record, and walked back to the front door. I stepped out onto the porch. The cool morning air felt good. The generator noise was louder now. Carolyn saw me immediately. A triumphant, predatory smile spread across her face. This was what she wanted. A confrontation. A public display of her authority. "Arthur," she called out, her voice dripping with condescension. "Good. You're awake. I was hoping you'd be here to witness this." I said nothing. I just stood on my porch, my phone held steady, recording her, the truck, the electricians, the gray utility box. She gestured grandly toward the men. "As you know, you are significantly in arrears on your HOA dues and fines. Over $10,000, in fact. The board has voted unanimously to exercise its rights under the covenants to enforce payment. We are terminating your access to community utilities until the balance is paid in full." One of the electricians, a younger man, looked hesitant. He glanced from her to me, then back to the formidable-looking hardware on the pole. He clearly knew this was not standard procedure. The older electrician just stared at the ground, wanting it to be over. I remained silent. I let her talk. I let the camera record. Her performance was for an imaginary audience, for the story she would later tell at the community barbecue. How she finally brought the stubborn old rancher to heel. "This is your final warning, Arthur," she said, her voice rising. "Pay what you owe, or you can live like your ancestors did. We have the right. It's in the bylaws, Section 14, Article B. I have a copy right here if you'd like to see it. She patted a slim, almost empty-looking binder she was carrying. I took a small step forward, just to the edge of the porch steps. My voice, when I finally used it, was quiet, much quieter than hers. "What is your full name?" She blinked, thrown off her script. "What?" "Your name. For the record," I said, holding the phone a little more obviously. Her eyes narrowed. "You know perfectly well who I am. I am Carolyn Bradshaw, president of the Oak Creek Estates Homeowners Association. And you are directing these men," I said, panning the camera slightly to include the electricians, "to sever the electrical connection at this junction box." "I am," she said, her confidence returning. "As is my right. And you are aware," I continued, my tone still conversational, "that you are currently standing on private property, parcel number 73-Alpha-4, registered to the estate of my late wife and myself, a property not subject to the covenants of the Oak Creek Estates, HOA. She laughed, a short, barking sound. "Don't be ridiculous, Arthur. This access road has been used by the community for years. It's a common area, and your refusal to pay your dues is a matter of public record." I zoomed the camera in slightly on her face. "Thank you, Carolyn," I said. Then I turned my attention to the electricians. "To you two gentlemen," I said, my voice firm but polite. "I am the legal owner of this property. That is my primary service connection. You are not employees of the County Utility Commission. You are private contractors. If you touch that box, I will not only sue your company for damages, but I will also file felony charges against you personally for willful destruction of property and criminal trespass. Your employer's insurance will not cover you for a criminal act." The younger man immediately took a step back, holding his hands up. The older one looked at Carolyn, his expression saying, "This is on you." Carolyn's face went from pink to a blotchy red. "He's bluffing. He's just an old man trying to scare you. The HOA will indemnify you. I am ordering you to proceed." I just stood there, camera rolling. I didn't need to say another word. The seed of doubt had been planted in fertile, working-class soil. These men weren't going to risk their careers and a criminal record for a woman in a pink tracksuit. The older electrician finally spoke, his voice a low grumble. "Ma'am, unless you can show us a court order or a direct work order from the utility company, we can't touch that. This is a civil matter." He started packing up his tools. The younger one was already halfway back to the van. Carolyn stood there, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. The entire performance had deflated. Her power, which was built entirely on bluff and the assumption that no one would ever check the facts, had just evaporated in the morning sun. She spun around to face me, her eyes blazing with a pure, unadulterated fury that was almost impressive. "This isn't over, Arthur," she hissed. "This is not over by a long shot. I will ruin you. I will line your property. I will bury you in legal fees until you are begging to sell this pathetic dirt patch to us." I let the camera record her threat. I let it capture the venom in her voice. Then I slowly lowered the phone. She had no idea. She had no idea of the scale of her miscalculation. She thought she was cutting the power to my house. She had no idea she was actually trying to cut a wire that would, in the end, turn off the lights to her entire world. She had no idea who she was dealing with. But before I tell you what I did next, I should probably explain how we got here. It's a story about paper, about deeds, and easements, and covenants. And it's a story about a woman who believed that rules were things she could invent, and a man who knew they were things you had to read. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I am 72 years old. For 45 of those years, I was a senior systems engineer for the largest power utility in the state. My specialty was grid management and infrastructure rights-of-way. In layman's terms, I was one of the guys who designed the high-voltage nervous system of our modern world. And more importantly, I was one of the lawyers, because you had to be a lawyer as much as an engineer in that job, who wrote and negotiated the legal agreements that allowed us to put our poles and wires and substations on other people's land. I retired about 6 years ago, a year after my wife Eleanor passed away. This ranch wasn't just a piece of property to me, it was my family's anchor. My great-grandfather bought the first 100 acres in 1912. He was a rancher, a real one. My grandfather added another 100. My father, a civil engineer like me, added the final 100. And he was the one who foresaw the city expanding outward and understood the value of what we had. He taught me to read a survey plat before I could read a novel. He taught me that ownership isn't a feeling, it's a document. A clear, legally recorded, unassailable document, on paper. Eleanor and I lived here our whole married life. We raised our daughter here. It was a place of profound peace, a sanctuary of rolling hills, ancient oaks, and the quiet rhythm of the seasons. After Eleanor was gone, the quiet became louder, but the peace remained. It was a legacy I was tasked with protecting. About 15 years ago, a developer bought the farmland to the east of us. They were planning a high-end gated community. Oak Creek Estates. The name itself was a fiction. The creek was a drainage ditch, and the only oaks were the ones on my side of the fence. To make their project viable, they needed power, a lot of it. The main high-tension lines ran along the far western edge of my property. To bring power to their new development, the most efficient route was to run a trunk line across my land and build a small, step-down substation to serve their 100-plus homes. The developer's lawyers approached me and my father. My father was still alive then, sharp as a tack. We sat with them in this very office. They were slick, full of promises. We were not. We were engineers. We dealt in specifications and tolerances. My father and I drafted the easement agreement ourselves. It was a work of art, if I do say so myself. It was 40 pages long, dense with clauses and sub-clauses that had been refined over my decades in the utility business. We granted them a non-exclusive easement for the sole purpose of transmitting electrical power to the residential lots specified in their development plan. We defined the exact path of the underground trunk line to the inch. We specified the location and footprint of the substation pad. We also included several what I like to call tripwire clauses. Clause 17CA stated that any and all maintenance must be performed by the licensed county utility provider, or a contractor approved in writing by us, with a minimum of 7 days' notice. Clause 21D specified that the easement was for transmission only and did not grant any general right-of-way or access for any other purpose. And then there was the beautiful, glorious, and utterly lethal Clause 32. Clause 32 was my masterpiece. It stipulated that if the grantee, the developer, or their successor, which was the HOA, ever attempted to interfere with, disrupt, or lay claim to the grantor's own utility services, or if they used the easement as leverage in any dispute unrelated to the physical maintenance of the electrical equipment itself, the easement would be considered in material breach. Upon written notification of such a breach, the grantor had the right to terminate the easement agreement entirely, effective in 90 days. The clause further required the grantee, at their own expense, to remove all their equipment and restore the land to its original condition. The developer's lawyers barely glanced at it. They were in a hurry. They saw a 70-year-old man and his son playing at being attorneys. They signed. We signed. We filed it with the county recorder's office. It became a permanent, legally binding attachment to the deed of every single property in Oak Creek Estates. On paper, they had power, but the paper also held the power to take it away. For the first few years, everything was fine. The houses went up, people moved in. They were mostly fine people, families, retirees. We'd wave when we passed on the county road. But then, about 5 years ago, Carolyn Bradshaw was elected president of the HOA. Carolyn wasn't an original owner. She and her husband had bought a house from a couple that was moving out of state. She arrived with an agenda. She saw the HOA not as a tool for maintaining community standards, but as a platform for her own ambition and a weapon to enforce her own narrow, brittle vision of suburban perfection. she was the performative tyrant. The stories started trickling over the fence line. Mrs. Gable, a widow in her 80s who lived in the house closest to my property, told me Carolyn had tried to fine her $200 because her garden gnome was not in keeping with the aesthetic of the community. Mr. Henderson was fined for having his garage door open for more than 3 hours. The fines were always small enough that it was cheaper to pay them than to fight them. It was a war of attrition. I was, of course, exempt. My 300-acre ranch was explicitly, by name and parcel number, excluded from the Oak Creek Estates development in its founding charter. I was not a member of the HOA. I was not subject to their covenants, their rules, or their president. This was a fact recorded in the same set of documents that created their little kingdom. On paper, I was a foreign country. Carolyn, however, was fundamentally incurious about paper. She operated on the basis of perceived reality. She saw that the only access road to the back half of her precious community ran for 100 yards over the corner of my land. It was an old farm track we'd let people use informally for years. She saw that the substation that powered her kingdom was sitting on my land. In her mind, this gave her leverage. She began to act as if I were just another resident, a particularly unruly one who needed to be brought into line. The first notice arrived 3 years ago. It was a bill for $500. Annual road maintenance fee, it said. I ignored it. A month later, another one arrived, this time with a late payment penalty of $50. I wrote a polite, simple letter back. I enclosed a copy of my deed and a copy of the HOA charter page that excluded my parcel. I explained that I was not a member of the HOA and therefore not subject to any fees. I sent it via certified mail. I kept the receipt. That was when the harassment began in earnest. Fines for the unapproved color of my barn roof. It's been red for 50 years. Fines for overgrown vegetation. It's a natural meadow. Fines for unauthorized agricultural activity. It's a ranch. Each notice was more absurd than the last. I never argued. I never engaged. I simply filed them. I created the green folder. Every letter, every envelope, every certified mail receipt went into that folder. I was building a monument to her madness, one piece of paper at a time. I kept the receipts. I knew where this was heading. Her frustration was growing. Her authority in her own mind was being challenged. An unenforced rule is, to a person like Carolyn, a personal insult. She couldn't touch my land. She couldn't touch my money, so she started looking for another point of pressure, and her eyes landed on the power lines. She saw the easement not as a contract we had granted her, but as a leash she held around my neck. About 6 months ago, I started getting notices that mixed the fabricated fines with a new threat. They mentioned unpaid community utility assessments and warned of service interruptions. This was the escalation I had been waiting for. She was about to step on the tripwire, clause 32. I knew I had to prepare. This wasn't going to be a shouting match over a fence. This was going to be a procedural battle, fought with documents and deadlines. It was the kind of fight I had been trained for my entire adult life. It was, in a strange way, a relief. The passive observation phase was over. It was time to get to work. Section. So, back to that morning. After Carolyn sped away in her luxury SUV, kicking up gravel and leaving the 2 bewildered electricians in her wake, I went back inside. I saved the video from my phone to my secure cloud drive and a copy to a dedicated hard drive. I labeled it bradshaw.encroachment.attempt.0642.date. Documentation is everything. I sat down at my desk. The green folder was there, waiting. It was now almost 4 inches thick. I didn't open it yet. First, I made a call. I dialed the number for the main office of my old employer, the utility company. I asked for the legal department. A young, eager-sounding paralegal answered. I explained who I was. My name still carried some weight in those halls, and I asked for a specific person. David Chen. David had been a junior engineer under my supervision for the last 5 years before I retired. He was brilliant, meticulous, and understood the intricate dance between engineering and law better than anyone I knew. He was now a project manager himself. "Arthur, it's great to hear your voice," he said, his tone genuinely warm. "I was just referencing one of your old papers on load balancing last week. It's still the gold standard. What can I do for you?" "I have a personal matter, David," I said. "A little easement dispute at my property. I need a second set of eyes on some documents, and possibly a formal survey." "An easement dispute involving you?" He laughed. "That's like a fish having a dispute with the ocean. I feel sorry for the other guy." "Don't be," I said. "Pride goeth before a fall. I need to be certain my foundations are as solid as I believe them to be. This is a hostile situation." I explained the basics. The HOA, the fake fines, the attempt to cut my power that morning. I told him about the easement agreement my father and I had drafted. There was a pause on the line. Then David said, "Arthur, did you say you included a termination for breach clause linked to interference with your own services?" "Clause 32, I confirmed." I could practically hear him grinning through the phone. "Oh, they have no idea. They have absolutely no idea you built the perfect trap and they're about to walk right into it. Send me everything, Arthur. The original easement, the county plat, the HOA charter, your correspondence. I'll look it over tonight." "I'm not asking you to do this as a favor, David. I'll pay your full consulting fee." "Don't be ridiculous," he said. "Consider it a professional courtesy, and frankly, a privilege. This is the stuff we live for." After the call, I spent the next 2 hours scanning every single document in the green folder. Every threatening letter from Carolyn, signed in her ostentatious scrawl. Every certified mail receipt I had sent. Every photograph I had taken of her petty rule-breaking, parking her car in front of the fire hydrant, putting up signs on common property that violated the very rules she enforced on others. I compiled it all into a single, password-protected digital file. I titled it, simply, the Bradshaw file. I emailed it to David. Then, I began to draft a letter. This was not a polite request. This was a formal, legal notice. It was addressed to the Oak Creek Estates Homeowners Association, Board of Directors, care of Carolyn Bradshaw, President. It began, "Notice of Material Breach of Easement Agreement, Parcel 73-A-4. I cited the easement agreement by its recording number at the county office. I detailed the events of that morning, specifying the time, the location, the name of the contractor, and Carolyn's explicit on-camera statements. I stated that this action constituted a direct and unambiguous violation of Clause 32 of the legally binding easement. I then wrote the sentence I had been waiting 3 years to write. Pursuant to the rights afforded the grantor under said Clause 32, you are hereby notified that the aforementioned easement agreement is terminated. This termination will become effective in 90 calendar days from the date of your receipt of this notice." I continued, quoting the rest of the clause verbatim, explaining that they had 90 days to file plans for the complete removal of the substation and all associated cabling, and 180 days for the work to be completed, all at their sole expense. Failure to comply would result in my contracting the work myself and billing the HOA for the total cost, plus a 20% administrative fee. I printed 2 copies, one for my files, one to be sent. I didn't just put it in the mail. I drove into town to the office of a private process server I had used in my professional life, a burly ex-cop named Frank. "Frank," I said, sliding the envelope across his desk, "I need this delivered to a Ms. Carolyn Bradshaw at this address. I need you to hand it to her personally, and I need your affidavit of service to be ironclad." Frank looked at the address. Oak Creek Estates. Her again? What did she do this time? Try to fine you for the color of the sky? "Something like that," I said. "It'll be a pleasure, Arthur," he said with a grim smile. "A real pleasure." With the notice sent, the 90-day clock had started. But I knew Carolyn wouldn't just accept it. she would escalate. Her entire worldview was predicated on the idea that she could not lose. When confronted with a document that said she wouldn't question her actions. She'd attack the document and the person who sent it. The next day, David called me. "I've read everything," he said, his voice a mixture of awe and professional outrage. "Arthur, this is even better than I thought. It's not just that she's violated your easement. I've been cross-referencing the HOA's own documents, the ones you sent me. They're publicly filed bylaws from when the association was formed. And," I asked, "and her entire campaign of fines against you is, according to their own rules, illegal. The section she quoted to you, Section 14, Article B, it grants the board the power to suspend utility access for delinquent members. But their own charter, in the preamble, explicitly defines members as the owners of the residential lots enumerated in Appendix A. Your parcel isn't in Appendix A. You are, legally speaking, not just a non-member, you are a non-entity to them. She's been using a rule that applies to her own residents, against an outsider. It's a fundamental misapplication of their own governing documents." This was the bombshell. I knew I wasn't a member, but David had found the precise language that proved it, language that a court would understand instantly. Her entire legal justification was a house of cards. "But it gets better," David said, his voice full of excitement. "The substation. I pulled the original utility commission filings for its construction. The developer filed for an expedited permit, classifying it as a single customer substation, with you, the property owner, being the primary customer of record, and the development being a secondary beneficiary of the pass-through. That's why the main junction is at your pole. On paper, at the State Utility Commission, that substation is servicing your ranch. The HOA is just a downstream user. She wasn't trying to cut off a delinquent member's power. She was trying to cut off the power to the primary account holder, in whose name the entire infrastructure is registered. She had no idea. She thought she was the queen of Oak Creek. On paper, with the state, she was just a guest on my power line." "David," I said, a cold, calm clarity settling over me, "I need you to do one more thing. I need a full, certified survey of the easement area and the access road. I want every boundary marked. I want it done to the highest legal standard." "I'll be there tomorrow morning," he said. "This is going to be biblical." The process server delivered the notice to Carolyn that evening. Frank called me afterwards. He said she read the first paragraph, laughed, and then tore the letter in half and threw it on her perfectly manicured lawn. "She said to tell you," Frank reported, "that your fake legal threats mean nothing, and that her lawyer would be in touch." Frank, of course, noted her response and the destruction of the notice in his official affidavit. Another brick in the wall of evidence. Carolyn's response was predictable. 2 days later, a shiny black sedan, with a vanity plate reading LGL-EGL, pulled up to my gate. A man in a suit far too expensive for our dusty part of the county got out. He didn't come to the door, he just affixed a notice to the gate. It was a cease and desist letter from her lawyer. It was full of bluster and legal-sounding nonsense, accusing me of harassment and making baseless claims. It demanded I retract my frivolous termination notice. It was a performance piece just like Carolyn's, all style, no substance. I put it in the green folder. The next move was hers. I knew she couldn't let the insult of my termination letter stand. She had to reassert her dominance, and since her attempt with the electricians had failed, she would now bring in a higher authority, one she thought she could manipulate. Sure enough, on a Saturday afternoon, a week after the incident with the electricians, a sheriff's department cruiser rolled slowly down my driveway. I was in the workshop, repairing a piece of equipment, but I heard it coming. I wiped my hands on a rag and walked out to meet it. Carolyn was standing beside the cruiser, already in mid-performance. She was gesturing wildly at the access track that cut across the corner of my property. A young deputy, looking professional but weary, was listening patiently, notebook in hand. "And he's blocked it off, officer," Carolyn was saying, her voice filled with manufactured panic. "This is a community road. We have an emergency right-of-way. What if there's a fire? He's endangering the lives of our children." She was pointing at a series of bright orange survey stakes that now lined the boundary of my property. David and his team had been thorough. The stakes, connected with fluorescent tape, clearly marked the edge of the old farm track. They showed, without ambiguity, that the track was entirely on my land. I hadn't blocked it. I had simply marked what was mine. The deputy saw me approaching. "Sir," he said, his tone neutral, "are you the owner of this property?" "I am," I said calmly. "Arthur Pendleton." "Ma'am here," he said, nodding toward Carolyn, "claims you've blocked a public access road." Carolyn jumped in. "He's trying to cut us off. He's been harassing me, sending threatening letters. I'm the president of the HOA and he's a menace." I ignored her. I looked directly at the deputy. "Officer, my name is Arthur Pendleton. This is my private property, parcel 73A4. What you see there is not a public road. It is a private track on my land. These are legally placed survey markers installed by a licensed state surveyor 2 days ago. Ms. Bradshaw is trespassing. I have not blocked anything. I have simply marked my property line." I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a folded document. It was a certified copy of my deed, with the county plat map attached. "This is my deed," I said, handing it to him. "As you can see, the property line is exactly where the stakes are. There is no dedicated public right-of-way on this track." The deputy took the document. He was young, but he clearly knew how to read a plat map. His eyes traced the lines, then looked up at the stakes, then back at the map. He saw that I was telling the truth. Carolyn sputtered, That's a fake. It's an old document. We have an easement." "An easement for what, ma'am?" the deputy asked, his patience clearly thinning. For access, and for our utilities," she stammered. "Officer," I said, my voice still quiet. "Ms. Bradshaw is referring to a utility easement for an electrical substation. I have a copy of that as well." I handed him a second folded document. "As you'll see in Clause 21D, it explicitly states the easement is for the utility line only, and grants no general right-of-way. Furthermore, as of 10 days ago, that easement is in material breach, and a notice of termination has been served. I would like to formally report Ms. Bradshaw for criminal trespass. This is the 3rd time she has entered my property without permission in the last 2 weeks." I have the first incident on video. The deputy's expression shifted. The subtle change from a civil mediator to an officer taking a report. He looked from the documents in his hand to my face, then to Carolyn's. He was seeing the 2 versions of reality. One was a hysterical performance. The other was calm, documented, and on paper. "Miss Bradshaw," the deputy said, his voice now colder, more official. "This is a civil matter, but this gentleman is correct. These documents indicate this is his private property. You are currently trespassing. I'm going to have to ask you to return to your vehicle and leave." The color drained from Carolyn's face. The authority figure she had summoned had not obeyed her. He had sided with the documents. He had sided with the facts. It was a concept she could not process. "You can't be serious," she shrieked. "He's the one breaking the law. I am the president." "Ma'am," the deputy said, his hand moving almost unconsciously toward his belt. "Leave, now, or I will cite you for trespassing." Defeated and humiliated, Carolyn stalked back to her car, muttering threats under her breath. The deputy watched her go, then turned back to me. He handed my documents back. "I'd recommend you keep these handy, Mr. Pendleton," he said. "My guess is you're going to need them again." "I will," I said. "Thank you for your professionalism, deputy. Would you mind including my statement, specifically that I am formally reporting her for trespass and that the utility easement has been terminated, in your official report? I'd like it on the record." A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. "It will be in the report, sir. Every word." He got back in his cruiser and drove away. I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence return. The police report was another document for the file. A report from a neutral officer of the law, confirming my ownership and her trespass. The foundation was getting stronger, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that her next move would be one of desperation. The deputy's visit seemed to be a catalyst. It was a public event. Neighbors had seen the cruiser. They had seen Carolyn being dressed down. The myth of her invincibility had been punctured. 2 days later, I got a visitor. It was Mrs. Gable, the elderly widow whose garden gnome had fallen afoul of Carolyn's aesthetic. She came to my door after dark, looking nervous, clutching a large manila envelope. "Arthur," she whispered, "I saw the sheriff. I saw what you did. You stood up to her." "I just stated the facts, Mary," I said, ushering her inside. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You did more than that. You showed her that her yelling doesn't change what's true. The rest of us, we've been too scared. She threatens lanes. She threatens to fine us into the poorhouse." She sat at my kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly. "She's a bully, Arthur, but she's also a cheat. I've known it for years." She pushed the manila envelope across the table. "I was on the finance committee for a year before she had me removed. She said I was too negative. The truth is, I was asking questions." I opened the envelope. Inside were copies of HOA financial statements from 2 years prior, and tucked within them were handwritten notes. "Look," she said, pointing a frail finger at a line item. "Special assessment for road resurfacing. Every homeowner was charged $1,000, except 2. Her and the treasurer, Mr. Klein. Their lots are marked waived by presidential decree." My eyes scanned the documents. It was all there. Carolyn, the great enforcer of rules, had been secretly exempting herself and her allies from the very fees she levied on everyone else. "There's more," Mrs. Gable said, her voice gaining strength. "She held a secret board meeting last month. Not all the board members were even invited. It was just her and 2 of her cronies. They voted to approve a special legal fund of $20,000 to pursue action against you. They're using our money to fund her personal vendetta." "How do you know this, Mary?" I asked gently. "Mark," she said. "Mark Jessup. He's on the board. He's young, and he's been going along with her because he doesn't like conflict. But he's a good man. He's sick of it. He told me about the meeting. He said it was illegal. They didn't have a quorum." This was gold. Not just evidence of financial malfeasance, but a procedural violation that could invalidate the board's actions. "Mary," I said, "you are a brave woman. This is very important." "Just use it to stop her, Arthur," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "Please, just make her stop." I promised I would. I scanned her documents into the Bradshaw file. The next morning I called Mark Jessup. I introduced myself and mentioned Mrs. Gable. He was hesitant at first, terrified of Carolyn finding out. "I just want to do what's right," he said, his voice low. "She's running this place like a dictator. That meeting, it felt wrong. She said since you weren't a member, the normal rules about notifying the community didn't apply." "Mr. Jessup," I said, "you have a fiduciary duty to the members of the HOA. That duty requires you to follow the bylaws. An unminuted meeting without a quorum is a serious breach of that duty. Any action taken as a result of that meeting, like allocating funds to sue me, is void. You could be held personally liable." I let that sink in. I wasn't threatening him. I was educating him. What should I do?" he asked. "Provide me with a sworn affidavit detailing what happened at that meeting," I said. "The date, the time, who was present, and what was voted on, that's all. Tell the truth on paper. It will protect you more than her friendship ever will." He agreed. He was the disillusioned insider, the crack in her fortress wall. The coalition was forming. It was no longer just me against her. It was me representing a growing number of residents who were tired of being bullied. The affidavit from Mark arrived a few days later via email. I now had proof of financial misconduct and procedural violations. The green folder was no longer just a defensive tool. It had become a weapon. Carolyn must have sensed her support was wavering. She must have felt her power slipping. And so, she made her final, desperate move. The ultimate act of escalation. A week later, just as the 30-day mark on my 90-day termination notice passed, a process server, not Frank, this one was a skinny kid who looked terrified, taped a thick envelope to my front door. Inside was a notice of lien. Carolyn, in her capacity as HOA president, had filed a construction lien against my entire 300-acre property. The amount was for $12,745.50, the sum total of all the fake fines she had ever sent me, plus legal fees. And she had filed for an emergency court hearing to foreclose on the lien in 60 days. A construction lien is a tool for contractors to get paid for work they've done on a property. To file one, you have to swear under oath that you have furnished labor or materials that improve the property. Carolyn had sworn, in a legal document submitted to the court, that the Oak Creek Estates, HOA, had provided over $12,000 worth of road maintenance, landscaping services, and administrative oversight to my ranch. It was perjury, bold, blatant, and breathtakingly stupid. She had taken her phantom fines, her imaginary violations, and tried to transform them into a real-world legal claim secured by my land. She was trying to use the court system to do what the electricians and the sheriff's deputy would not. She was trying to force the sale of my family's legacy to pay for her fictional grievances. This was the final mistake. She had moved the battle from the realm of HOA bylaws and private agreements into a court of law. She had invited a judge to look at the paper trail. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer. Not a utility lawyer this time. I called the meanest, most thorough real estate litigator in the county. "Bob," I said, "it's Arthur Pendleton. I have a situation here, and I think you're going to enjoy it." The hearing was set for a date 50 days later, just 10 days before the easement termination was due to become final. This was the end game, the public confrontation. The setting was courtroom 3B of the county courthouse, a sterile, serious room that smelled of old paper and floor wax. I had my lawyer, Bob, handle the pretrial filings. We didn't just ask for the lien to be dismissed. We filed a countersuit. We sued the Oak Creek Estates, HOA, for filing a fraudulent lien, a crime in our state. We sued Carolyn Bradshaw personally for perjury and for violating her fiduciary duty to the HOA. We asked for the lien to be summarily dismissed with prejudice. We asked for our legal fees to be paid. And, as a final flourish, we filed an emergency injunction, citing the fraudulent lien as further evidence of harassment to force the HOA to recognize the validity of our easement termination notice. The day of the hearing arrived. The courtroom was surprisingly full. On one side, clustered behind Carolyn and her expensive lawyer, was her small group of supporters from the board. They looked smug and confident. On the other side, sitting behind me and Bob, was a growing contingent from the neighborhood. Mrs. Gable was there, looking determined. Mark Jessup was there, looking nervous but resolute. Several other families who had been fined and harassed by Carolyn were there too, drawn by the prospect of seeing justice done. They were my silent allies, a jury of her peers. Carolyn was dressed for a victory speech, a severe navy blue suit, hair sprayed into a rigid helmet. She sat at her table whispering to her lawyer, occasionally glancing over at me with a look of pure contempt. She believed the force of her personality, the performance of her conviction, would carry the day. She believed the judge was just another person to be managed. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Miller, entered. She had a reputation for being sharp, impatient with theatrics, and a stickler for the rules. I knew from my research that she had a background in contract law. Carolyn's lawyer went first. He was slick. He spoke of community, of shared responsibility, of the long-standing historical use of the access road. He painted me as a wealthy isolationist landowner, trying to bully a small community. He presented the stack of fines as legitimate bills for services rendered. He spoke of my unneighborly behavior in trying to terminate the power easement, which he called a vital community asset. It was a beautiful performance, full of emotion and righteous indignation. It had absolutely nothing to do with the law. When he finished, Judge Miller looked at him over her glasses. "Counselor," she said, her voice dry as dust, "you have presented a compelling narrative. Do you have any documents to support the claim that Mr. Pendleton is a member of your HOA, or that this lien is for actual labor or materials furnished?" The lawyer faltered. "Well, Your Honor, the use of the facilities implies consent. That's not what I asked." The judge cut in. "Show me the paper." Then it was Bob's turn. Bob was the opposite of Carolyn's lawyer. He was a big, rumpled man who looked more like a history professor than a litigator. He didn't make a speech. He just walked to the clerk and began entering exhibits into the record. "Your Honor," he began, his voice a calm rumble. "Will be brief. Exhibit A, a certified copy of the deed for parcel 73A4, belonging to my client, Mr. Pendleton." He placed it on the judge's bench. Exhibit B, a certified copy of the founding charter of the Oak Creek Estates, HOA. I draw your attention to the preamble, which defines membership, and to Appendix A, the list of member lots, which does not include my client's parcel. The judge read it, her expression unreadable. Exhibit C, the sworn affidavit of the process server who delivered the notice of easement termination, noting that the recipient, Ms. Bradshaw, destroyed the legal notice in his presence. A murmur went through the courtroom. Carolyn shot a venomous look at her lawyer. Exhibit D, the official report from the sheriff's department, where my client reported Ms. Bradshaw for criminal trespass, and where the responding officer confirmed my client's ownership of the land in question. Exhibit E, the sworn affidavit of Mr. Mark Jessup, a member of the HOA board, detailing an illegal meeting where Miss Bradshaw secured funds to pursue this frivolous action. Mark sat up a little straighter. Carolyn's face had gone rigid. Exhibit F, the financial records provided by Mrs. Mary Gable, a former member of the Finance Committee, showing a pattern of Ms. Bradshaw waiving fees for herself and her associates while aggressively pursuing fictional fees against my client. Mrs. Gable gave a small, firm nod. The people behind her were now leaning forward, hanging on every word. "And finally, Your Honor," Bob said, picking up one last document. Exhibit G, the sworn document filed by Miss Bradshaw to obtain this lien. In it, she attests under penalty of perjury that her organization provided over $12,000 in labor and materials to improve my client's property. Bob paused, letting the weight of the statement settle in the quiet room. "Your Honor, this is not just a frivolous lien. It is a fraudulent one. It is perjury. It is an attempt to use this court to perpetrate a fraud. We ask for immediate summary judgment, for the dismissal of the lien with prejudice, for all our legal fees to be awarded, and for the court to refer Ms. Bradshaw's conduct to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation." Bob sat down. The entire presentation had taken less than 10 minutes. He hadn't raised his voice once. He simply let the documents speak for themselves. There was a long silence. Judge Miller looked down at the pile of evidence. She read through Exhibit G, the lien filing, one more time. Then she looked up, her gaze settling on Carolyn Bradshaw. This was the moment, the collapse. The mask didn't just drop, it shattered. The smug confidence, the righteous anger, the performative victimhood, it all evaporated in an instant. It was replaced by a blank, hollow-eyed panic. It was the look of a chess player who has just realized they've been in checkmate for 10 moves and didn't even know it. She finally understood. She understood that her feelings didn't matter. Her stories didn't matter. Her performance didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the paper. And the paper was a mountain she could not move. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She just stared, her face a pale, slack mask of disbelief. She had no idea, she never had. Judge Miller's voice was ice. "Ms. Bradshaw, she said. "You have signed a sworn legal document. Are you prepared to testify under oath right now that your HOA paved Mr. Pendleton's roads and landscaped his 300-acre ranch?" Carolyn's lawyer shot to his feet. "Your Honor, my client—" "Sit down, counselor," the judge snapped without looking at him. "I am speaking to Miss Bradshaw." All eyes were on Carolyn. The silence in the room was absolute. She swallowed hard, her Adam's apple bobbing. She looked at her lawyer for help, but he was staring at his legal pad, as if it held the secrets of the universe. She looked at her supporters, but they were now looking at their shoes. She was utterly alone. I, she stammered. "I believed we had the right—" "That is not what I asked," Judge Miller said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I will ask you one more time. Did you, or did you not, provide the services you swore you provided in this lien application?" Carolyn stared at the judge, her face crumbling. The finality of her situation was crashing down on her. A quiet, pathetic "no" escaped her lips. The verdict was swift and brutal. The judge dismissed the lien with prejudice, meaning it could never be refiled. She awarded us every penny of our legal fees, ordering the HOA to pay. She then turned her attention to Carolyn personally. "Ms. Bradshaw," the judge said, her disappointment and anger palpable, "your actions constitute a flagrant abuse of the legal system and a breach of your duties to your own community. This court finds that you knowingly filed a fraudulent instrument. I am, as requested, referring this matter in its entirety to the district attorney's office with a strong recommendation for prosecution on charges of perjury." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. It was one thing to lose a civil case. It was another entirely to be sent up for a criminal one. Furthermore, the judge continued, regarding the matter of the utility easement. Given the evidence of a sustained campaign of harassment culminating in this fraudulent lien, this court finds that the defendant, the Oak Creek Estates HOA, is indeed in material breach of the easement agreement dated April 12, 2005. The plaintiff's notice of termination is hereby declared valid and enforceable. The 90-day clock, which began on— she glanced at Bob's filing— is ticking. The HOA has 10 days remaining to comply with the terms of termination. This court is adjourned. She banged the gavel. It echoed in the stunned silence like a gunshot. The aftermath was a slow-motion demolition. Carolyn was recalled as HOA president in an emergency meeting a week later. The vote wasn't even close. Mark Jessup was elected interim president, tasked with cleaning up the mess. The HOA's insurance refused to cover the legal judgment because Carolyn's actions were willful and illegal, not simple negligence. A special assessment had to be levied on all the homeowners, a real one this time, to pay my legal fees. The irony was not lost on anyone. The district attorney did press charges. Faced with the mountain of evidence, Carolyn pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of filing a false document. She received 2 years of probation, a hefty fine, and was barred from ever serving on any board or committee in the state again. She and her husband sold their house at a loss 6 months later and moved away. They left in the middle of the night. The HOA, under Mark's new leadership, had to face the reality of the terminated easement. They had 10 days. The cost to reroute their power supply around my property was astronomical, well over $1 million. They would have to dig up roads, get new permits, and it would take at least a year. They would be without power. Panic set in. Mark Jessup came to see me. He didn't come in a fancy car or with a lawyer. He walked down my driveway, hat in hand. He stood on my porch and apologized. On behalf of the entire community, he admitted they had allowed a bully to run roughshod over them and that I had become the undeserving target of her obsession. "We were wrong, Arthur," he said, his voice full of genuine remorse. "And now we're facing a catastrophe. Is there anything at all we can do?" I had been waiting for this. I didn't want to punish the 100 families who lived in Oak Creek. I just wanted the rules to be respected. I wanted the contract to be honored. I invited him into my office. I had a new document waiting on the desk. "This," I said, "is a new easement agreement." It was almost identical to the old one. It granted them the right to use the substation and the power lines. But it had a few additions. It included a new clause that explicitly stated my property was not and would never be subject to the HOA's authority. It included a personal conduct clause stating that any harassment of the grantor by any board member would trigger an immediate, non-negotiable fine of $50,000, payable by the HOA, and it included an annual lease payment of $1, payable every January 1st, as a symbolic acknowledgement that they were guests on my land. And one more thing, I said. I pointed to another document. It was a list of all the fines Carolyn had improperly levied against other residents over the years. Mrs. Gable's gnome, fine. Mr. Henderson's garage door, fine. Dozens of others. You will refund every single one of these with interest, in writing, with a formal apology from the board. Mark read the agreement. He looked at the list of refunds. Tears welled in his eyes, not of sadness, but of relief. This is more than fair, Arthur. It's generous. It's not generous, Mark, I said. It's correct. It's what the arrangement should have been all along, based on respect for the paper. The board signed it the next day. The old easement expired, and the new one took effect the moment after. The lights in Oak Creek Estates did not go out. The community began to heal. The atmosphere of fear that Carolyn had cultivated dissipated. People started talking to each other again. Mrs. Gable put her gnome back in the garden. Mr. Henderson left his garage door open all weekend. People started waving as they drove past my ranch again, but this time the wave felt different. It felt like a greeting between respectful neighbors, not a gesture between a king and his subjects. I sit on my porch now, in the same chair with the same mug of coffee. The quiet has returned, but it's a deeper, more satisfying quiet. It's the quiet of order restored. The green folder sits on my desk, but it's closed now, its purpose served. It's a monument not to madness, but to the simple, powerful idea that truth, when documented, is its own defense. Sometimes I look out at the spot where Carolyn stood that morning, so full of misplaced confidence, and I think about the nature of ownership. You can't own something just by declaring you do. You can't create a right by simply exercising it. Ownership is a responsibility. It's a chain of title, a history recorded on paper, a set of rules agreed upon and respected. My father taught me that. My career was built on it. And in the end, it was the lesson that Carolyn Bradshaw had to learn in the harshest way possible. She thought power came from a title and a loud voice. I knew it came from a pen, a notary stamp, and a file in the county recorder's office. She had no idea, but now she does. And the lights are still on. On paper.